A homeless woman covered a lost boy with her blanket at dawn, then collapsed against the brick wall, hypothermic. The vampire king caught her before she hit the pavement. What no one realized, by saving his son, she'd triggered a blood debt clause so old even his council had forgotten it existed, and he'd just declared her under his eternal protection in front of 17 witnesses. Elena Thorne had learned to recognize the particular silence that came before dawn, that held breath moment, when the city paused between the dangerous hours and the merely cold ones, and on this February morning, she woke to it on a loading dock behind a shuttered church, with frost painting delicate patterns across the cardboard she had wedged between her body and the concrete. The gray wool blanket that represented her sole remaining possession from a life that felt increasingly like something she had dreamed lay twisted around her shoulders, and she pulled it tighter as she sat up, her breath crystallizing in small clouds that disappeared almost immediately into the pre-dawn dark. 6 months on the streets had taught her to wake fully and quickly, to assess threats before her eyes were completely open, and she catalogued her surroundings with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that hesitation could mean the difference between safety and violence. The warehouse district stretched silent around her, all shuttered windows and locked gates, and she was about to stand when she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it beneath the distant groan of a garbage truck several blocks away. Crying. A child crying. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Elena pushed herself to her feet, despite the protests of muscles that had spent the night tensed against the cold, and she followed the sound to the front of the church, where a small figure huddled against the stone steps, barefoot despite the frost that glittered on every surface. The boy could not have been more than 7, dressed in clothes that looked expensive even in the half-light, dark pants and a sweater that probably cost more than Elena had earned in her last month at the conservatory before it closed, before everything fell apart. She knelt beside him without thinking, her knees protesting against the frozen pavement, and reached out to touch his shoulder. Ice cold. His skin felt like touching marble in winter, and she jerked her hand back before forcing herself to try again. He was shivering, small tremors that shook his entire frame, but when she looked closer, she realized something was wrong. The child was not breathing vapor into the cold air. She was creating small clouds with every exhalation, but the boy's mouth and nose produced nothing, as if the cold that should have turned his breath visible simply did not exist for him. Elena felt something twist in her chest, a recognition of wrongness that she could not name. But the boy was crying, and he was cold, and those were the only facts that mattered in the moment. She unwrapped the gray blanket from her shoulders, felt the pre-dawn chill knife through the 3 layers of clothing she wore beneath it, and draped the wool around the small, shaking body. "Someone will find you," she whispered, and meant it, hoped it, because she had nothing else to offer this strange, cold child who did not breathe. The world tilted then, gray edges creeping into her vision, and she recognized the sensation from 2 weeks ago when she had stayed out too long in a snowstorm. Hypothermia. Her body was shutting down, stealing warmth from her extremities to protect her core, and she had given away her only defense against it. Elena tried to stand, to move, to do something other than sink down against the brick wall beside the boy, but her legs would not cooperate. The pavement rushed up to meet her, and she had the strangest thought that at least she would not feel the impact, would not feel anything soon, and then hands caught her, strong and impossibly fast, and she found herself looking up into eyes that reflected the streetlight like mirrors, silver and depthless, and utterly inhuman. The man who held her stood impossibly still, the kind of stillness that suggested a predator calculating its next move, and his skin against hers felt only marginally warmer than the boy's had been. He was beautiful in the way that museum sculptures were beautiful, all perfect angles and carved features, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Elena's bones vibrate with it. Under the covenant of first blood, I claim eternal protection for this woman. Witnessed. The words made no sense to her oxygen-starved brain, but suddenly the empty street was not empty at all. Figures materializing from shadows that should not have been deep enough to hide them. Elena counted 17 before she lost focus. 17 people who appeared from nowhere, some dressed in dark suits that suggested security or law enforcement, others in clothes that looked centuries out of date. Two wore police uniforms and their eyes held the same empty glaze she had seen once in the face of a man who had been hypnotized at a street festival before the conservatory closed. Before. The Vampire King? Because what else could he be with those eyes, and that stillness, and that voice, lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and the last thing Elena registered before darkness took her completely was the boy, her blanket still wrapped around him, looking up at the man with an expression of such relief and love that it hurt to witness. The child was not breathing because he did not need to breathe, and Elena's last conscious thought before the world went black was the hysterical recognition that she had just wrapped her only blanket around a vampire. When consciousness returned, it came in stages, warmth first, then the sensation of softness beneath her body, then the gradual awareness that she was lying in a bed more comfortable than any she had known even before the streets claimed her. Elena kept her eyes closed and catalogued sensations, another survival skill learned in shelters where waking suddenly could draw unwanted attention. Silk sheets against her skin, the distant hum of climate control, a faint scent of something old, like leather-bound books and wood polish. She risked opening her eyes and immediately wished she had not, because the room that surrounded her could have been transplanted from a museum, all antique furniture and oil paintings and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling to reveal a city view that meant she was at least 20 stories up. The painting directly across from the bed stopped her breath. A portrait dated 1687 according to the small plaque on its frame, depicting a man in period dress who looked exactly, precisely, impossibly like the person who had caught her in the street. Elena sat up too quickly, and the room spun, forcing her to grip the silk sheets until her knuckles went white and the dizziness passed. The door opened without sound, and the Vampire King entered, followed by a woman in her 40s wearing a white coat that marked her as medical personnel. Her expression professionally neutral in a way that suggested she had seen stranger things than homeless women waking in vampire estates. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen," the woman said without preamble, moving to the bedside to check Elena's pulse with fingers that felt blessedly warm and human. "You were hypothermic when Lucienne brought you in. We've been monitoring you for the past 6 hours." Lucienne. So the Vampire King had a name. Elena watched him standing near the door, that same predatory stillness evident in every line of his body, and tried to reconcile the creature before her with the stories she had heard whispered in shelters, tales of monsters that fed on blood and controlled the city from shadows. Dr. Chen continued her examination, shining a light in Elena's eyes, checking her extremities for frostbite. And through it all, Lucian watched with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle. "I need to leave," Elena said, her voice coming out rougher than intended. She pushed the sheets aside and discovered someone had changed her clothes while she slept, replacing her layered streetwear with a nightgown that probably cost more than her last month's rent. The violation of it, the casual assumption that they could undress her while unconscious, sent anger flooding through her system hot enough to override the lingering cold. "You're still hypothermic," Dr. Chen said calmly, blocking Elena's path to the door with her body. "And there are other complications." "What complications?" Elena demanded, looking past the doctor to Lucienne, who had not moved, had barely blinked since entering the room. "The blood debt clause," Lucienne said, and his voice still carried that preternatural weight that made Elena want to obey without understanding why. "You saved my son without expectation of reward. Under the covenant of first blood, you are now under my eternal protection unto your natural death or your release of the bond." Elena stared at him, trying to parse the formal language into something that made sense. I gave a cold child my blanket. That doesn't mean I need protection. Dr. Chen exchanged a look with Lu Shen that suggested volumes of unspoken communication. The blood debt clause hasn't been invoked in over 300 years, the doctor said carefully. The fact that Lu Shen declared it in front of 17 witnesses means you cannot be harmed or expelled without your consent. It also means his enemies will target you to void the debt. I don't have enemies, Elena said. But even as the words left her mouth, she recognized their foolishness. She had enemies now, whether she wanted them or not, enemies who saw her as a political liability or a tactical weakness. Lucien's council, the Midnight Assembly, is furious that he's protecting a mortal, Dr. Chen continued. They see you as a vulnerability. Some of them would kill you simply to free Lucian from the obligation. Elena felt the walls closing in, the trap tightening around her with implications she was only beginning to understand. So I'm a prisoner here. Not a prisoner, Lucian said, finally moving from his position by the door to stand near the windows where dawn light was beginning to filter through glass that must have been specially treated because he showed no signs of burning. A protected guest. There's a difference. Elena laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. I was homeless 6 hours ago. Now I'm a political pawn in vampire games I don't understand. What's the difference? The difference is choice, Lucian said quietly. You can leave any time you wish. But if you do, the protection ends, and my enemies will find you within hours. Elena wanted to argue, to insist she could take care of herself, but 6 months on the streets had taught her the value of shelter and the cost of pride. Where's the boy? She asked instead. Cassian, Lucien said, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Safe. For now. That's the 4th time this month he's run away from the estate. Every nanny, tutor, and caretaker has failed. Why does a vampire child need protecting? Elena asked, watching Lucien's face carefully. Because there are worse things than daylight that hunt us now, Lucien said, his expression darkening in a way that suggested old grief and fresh fear. And my son is vulnerable in ways I don't fully understand. The conversation ended there, Dr. Chen insisting Elena needed rest and nutrients, Lucien withdrawing with that same unsettling silence, and Elena found herself alone in a room worth more than everything she had ever owned combined, trying to decide if she had been rescued or captured. 8 hours later, evening settling over the city like a blanket, Elena felt strong enough to explore despite Dr. Chen's protests. The estate revealed itself in stages as she walked its corridors, each room more overwhelming than the last, all priceless art and antique furniture, and the kind of wealth that felt obscene when she thought about the people still sleeping on loading docks. She found the East Wing almost by accident, following the sound of crying to a door that should have been locked, but yielded to the hairpin she kept tucked in her sleeve, a survival tool that had opened more than one shelter locker when she needed clothes or food. The room beyond was dark except for a sliver of light from the hallway, and in that light she saw the boy from the church steps, Cassian, huddled in the corner with his knees pulled to his chest. Elena knelt beside him, moving slowly so as not to startle him, and realized in the dim light that his eyes were open but unfocused, silver like his father's, but tracking nothing, following no movement. Blind. The child was blind. Without thinking, without planning, Elena began to hum, a lullaby from her conservatory days when she had studied classical voice and dreamed of stages and applause. The melody came from muscle memory, notes she had not sung in months, and Cassian went utterly still, his crying cutting off mid-sob as if someone had flipped a switch. Elena kept humming, kept the melody simple and clear, and watched as the tension slowly drained from the small body. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, time losing meaning in the dark room with the blind child and the lullaby that seemed to calm him in ways nothing else could. The door opened, and Lucien stood silhouetted in the light from the hallway, his expression unreadable, as he watched his son sleeping in Elena's arms. "That song," Lucian said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual preternatural weight. "Where did you learn it?" "The conservatory," Elena said. "Before it closed. It's from the 1600s, I think. Italian." Lucian moved into the room with that predator Grace kneeling beside them. "I used to sing that to his mother. Before she was killed." Elena felt the weight of that statement, the grief contained in those simple words. "I'm sorry," she said, because what else could she say? Lucien looked at his sleeping son, at Elena holding him, and something shifted in his expression. He hasn't slept without compulsion in months. Every caretaker, every specialist, they all failed. But you, a stranger, you sang him to sleep in minutes. "I'm not that special," Elena said. "I just knew the right song." "My council wants you gone," Lucian said, meeting her eyes. "They see you as a liability, a weakness to exploit, but my son needs you. Stay, not as my debt, but as his caretaker. Name your price." Elena looked at the child in her arms, felt the weight of him, the trust implicit in his sleeping form. She had nowhere else to go, no other options, but pride made her negotiate anyway. "I stay until he doesn't need me anymore," she said. "And you teach me why a vampire king's son is blind and hunted." "Deal," Lucian said, extending his hand. His skin felt cold against hers when they shook, but his grip was steady, certain, the grip of someone who kept his promises. Elena held that hand and wondered what she had just agreed to, what price she would ultimately pay for shelter and purpose, and the strange comfort of a blind child's trust. And in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that she had just traded one form of homelessness for another, but at least this one came with warmth and safety and a lullaby that could stop a vampire child from crying. Elena woke to morning light filtering through curtains she did not remember closing and found a wardrobe filled with clothes that had not been there the night before, all in shades of black and gray and charcoal, each piece exactly her size down to the half-inch she had lost in the past 6 months of inadequate nutrition. Someone had been paying attention, cataloging her preferences with the kind of detail that felt both thoughtful and invasive, and she dressed in dark jeans and a gray sweater soft enough to make her throat tight with the memory of when she could afford such things. The breakfast room waited at the end of a corridor lined with portraits of people who had been dead for centuries, their painted eyes following her progress with aristocratic disdain, and she found Cassian already seated at a table positioned to catch the morning sun, streaming through windows that must have been specially treated because the light held none of the lethal quality she had heard sunlight possessed for vampires. The boy sat motionless, his silver eyes fixed on nothing, and Elena felt her heart contract at the isolation evident in every line of his small body. She took the seat beside him, rather than across from him, close enough that he could hear her breathing, and examined the breakfast spread with the eye of someone who had recently lived on soup kitchen meals and whatever she could afford from convenience stores. "Good morning, Cassian," she said softly, and received no response beyond a slight tightening around his mouth that suggested he had heard her, but chosen not to acknowledge it. The door opened and a man entered, who moved with the predatory grace that marked him as vampire, his face holding the kind of timeless quality that suggested centuries rather than decades, and his expression when he looked at Elena contained enough contempt to fill the room. "Victor Oleander," he said without offering his hand, "head of household staff. I've been instructed to assist you in your duties, though I expect you'll last no longer than the others." Elena met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated despite the clear threat in his tone. "How many others have there been?" 23, Victor said, moving to pour coffee with movements too precise to be human. "You're mortal. You'll break." "They all do." The casual certainty in his voice sparked anger hot enough to override Elena's uncertainty, but she swallowed the retort and turned her attention to Cassian, who had not moved, had not reached for any of the food arranged before him. The boy needed to eat, Dr. Chen had explained the previous evening. Vampires his age required both blood and regular food for proper development, but Cassian sat statue still and showed no interest in the elaborate breakfast. Elena did not push, did not cajole. Instead, she picked up a strawberry and held it close enough for the scent to reach him. "This smells like summer rain on warm pavement," she said quietly, aware of Victor watching with barely concealed scorn. Like the moment right after a storm when everything is clean and new and the world smells green. Cassian's head tilted slightly, tracking her voice, and Elena continued. "The texture is interesting, bumpy and soft at the same time, and if you bite into it, the juice is sweet and a little tart, like if sunshine had a flavor." She set the strawberry on his plate and picked up a piece of toast. "This is plain, simple, but it's warm, and if you listen closely, you can hear it crackle when you break it, like tiny fireworks." Cassian's hand moved, slow and uncertain, and his fingers found the strawberry. He brought it to his mouth and took a small bite, chewing carefully, and Elena felt victory surge through her chest. Another bite, then another, and soon he was eating with more enthusiasm, his movements gaining confidence as Elena described each item on his plate in terms of sound and scent and sensation. Victor watched this small miracle with an expression that suggested he was reassessing his initial judgment, and when he spoke again, some of the contempt had drained from his tone. "The cameras in the corners are for security," he said, gesturing to the small black domes Elena had noticed earlier. "We've had threats." Elena looked at those cameras, at the implied surveillance that meant nothing she did went unobserved, and felt the estate's true nature settle over her like a weight. This was not a home, it was a fortress, and Cassian was not just protected, but imprisoned. "Who's hunting him?" she asked Victor directly, watching his face for tells. The vampire's eyes flicked to the windows, to the sunlight that should have been safety, and his silence was answer enough. Elena spent the rest of the morning learning the estate's rhythms. The way staff moved through corridors with clockwork precision, the security checkpoints disguised as doorways, the sense that every breath was monitored and catalogued, and by the time Lucian summoned her to the sublevel, she understood that she had agreed to live in a gilded cage. The descent took them past the main floors into bedrock carved into chambers that predated the building above, and the council room that opened before her looked like something from a fantasy novel. All bioluminescent fungi casting greenish light across stone walls, carved with symbols she did not recognize. The midnight assembly waited in a semicircle, 7 vampires who represented centuries of accumulated power, and their attention focused on Elena with the weight of apex predators assessing prey. Magistrate Theron Vask spoke first, his voice carrying the dry rasp of extreme age. "This mortal has no place among us. The blood debt is archaic, a relic from times when we were weaker and needed mortal allies. Expel her and be done with this farce." Lady Isadora Crane leaned forward, her 1920s bob and flapper aesthetic at odds with the ancient chamber, and her smile held calculation rather than warmth. "Or we leverage the debt, use her as proof of our benevolence toward mortals, a public relations asset in our ongoing negotiations with human governments. She's a tool, Theron, not a threat." Marcus Hale, built like a soldier and carrying himself with military precision, slammed his fist on the stone table hard enough to crack it. "She saved the heir. That alone earns her protection under every covenant we hold sacred. Lucian stands by tradition, as should we all." The debate escalated, vampires arguing over Elena's fate, as if she were not standing 10 feet away, and she listened to them discuss her utility and her danger with the detached calm of someone who had learned not to expect agency in her own life. Lucian stood silent through most of it, his expression unreadable, and only when Theron began projecting holographic images did the Vampire King finally speak. "Enough," Lucian said quietly, but the single word cut through the argument like a blade. "You want to know why I invoked the blood debt? Watch." The hologram shifted, showing footage of an attack on a vampire estate much like this one, and Elena watched in horror as daylight weapons, concentrated UV beams, cut through vampire defenders like paper. Fire consumed the building in minutes. Precision strikes that suggested extensive planning and inside knowledge, and when the footage ended, 7 vampires lay dead, including 2 children. The Ember Court, Theron said heavily. They've been escalating for months. 3 estates attacked, 17 of our kind killed, and always they target the children first. Trying to force a succession crisis, Isadora added. If they can eliminate enough heirs, they can destabilize our entire governance structure and seize power in the chaos. They killed my bonded mate 2 years ago, Lucian said, and his voice held so much controlled grief that Elena felt it like a physical blow. Marianne died protecting Cassian, and whoever betrayed us to the Ember Court is still inside this organization, still feeding them information, still hunting my son. You're not just protecting him, Elena said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. You're hiding him. From our own people, yes, Lucien confirmed, because I don't know who I can trust. The blood debt gives me legal grounds to keep Elena close, to have a caretaker who cannot be compelled or controlled by any vampire in this room. She's outside our political games, which makes her the safest person to guard my son. The council absorbed this in silence, and Elena felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders like iron. I'll stay, she said before anyone could argue further. But I want to know everything, all the threats, all the suspects, everything you're hiding. Knowledge makes you a target, Lucian said. Ignorance keeps you safe. Then I'll be a target, Elena shot back, because I won't protect a child blind to the dangers he faces. The standoff held for a long moment before Lucian nodded once, a sharp acknowledgement of her demand, and Elena knew she had just traded whatever safety ignorance might have provided for the burden of understanding exactly how much danger surrounded them all. 3 days passed in a rhythm of discovery as Elena learned to navigate Cassian's world through sound and touch rather than sight, and she found herself developing an appreciation for how the boy perceived his environment. He moved through rooms clicking softly, a sound she initially mistook for nervousness, until she realized he was echolocating, using the reverb to map spaces in his mind. And when she tried it herself, she understood the 3-dimensional picture it created, all depth and distance and texture. Music affected him in ways that went beyond normal response, specific frequencies calming him, while others made him agitated, and Elena began to catalog which songs brought peace and which brought distress. The breakthrough came on the 3rd afternoon, when Elena found the music room on the estate's 2nd floor. A space that looked frozen in time with its 1905 Steinway piano sitting silent beneath a dust cover. She removed the cover with reverent hands, her fingers finding the keys with the muscle memory of 10,000 practice hours, and she began to play a Chopin nocturne she had once performed at a conservatory recital. The music filled the room with liquid sound, each note precise and clear, and she was so lost in the performance that she did not notice Cassian until he appeared in the doorway, drawn by the melody like a moth to flame. Elena kept playing, watching the boy from the corner of her eye as he moved into the room with more confidence than she had yet seen, navigating by sound alone until he stood beside the piano. She transitioned to a simpler melody, something she could play with one hand, and reached out to take Cassian's hand with the other. Feel this, she said, placing his palm flat against the piano's wood. The vibrations travel through the whole instrument. You can see the music through touch. Cassian's expression shifted, wonder replacing the usual blankness, and when Elena played a chord, his fingers trembled against the wood. Mama played this song, he said, and his voice cracked on the words, rusty from disuse. Elena's heart seized, but she kept playing, kept the melody steady. Tell me about her, she said gently. She sang every night, Cassian said haltingly, words coming in fragments as if he had forgotten how to construct sentences. She smelled like roses and her hands were always warm, and she promised she would never leave me. But then the fire came and the men with the lights, and she screamed and I screamed, and then she was gone, and Papa couldn't make it better. and I couldn't see anymore because seeing meant remembering, and I didn't want to remember. The confession poured out in a rush, 2 years of trauma compressed into run-on sentences, and Elena understood with sudden clarity that Cassian's blindness was not physical damage, but psychological protection, his mind shutting down his vision to escape the horror of watching his mother die. I lost everything too, Elena said quietly, still playing. I lost my career and my home and my identity. Everything I thought made me who I was. We're both trying to find our way in the dark, but maybe we can help each other see again. Cassian looked at her with those silver eyes that tracked nothing, and slowly, tentatively, he began to hum along with the melody. His voice was thin and uncertain, but it was there, joining hers in fragile harmony, and Elena felt tears track down her cheeks at the sound. From the hallway, unnoticed by either of them, Lucian stood watching, and for the first time in 2 years, hope cracked through the carefully maintained control that had kept him functional through grief. Hope that maybe his son could heal, that maybe this strange mortal woman could accomplish what centuries of vampire power could not. 2 weeks later, the routines Elena had established felt almost normal. Morning music lessons where Cassian's voice grew stronger each day. Afternoon explorations of the gardens where she taught him to identify plants by texture and scent. Evening stories that she made up or adapted from books she found in the library. Cassian was eating regularly, sleeping through the day without nightmares, even laughing at her terrible jokes. And Elena felt herself settling into the role of caretaker with an ease that surprised her. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered through normal postal channels despite the estate's security, and Marcus Hale brought it to Elena with an expression that promised violence. "It's addressed to you," he said, setting the small box on the table with exaggerated care. "We've scanned it for explosives and biological threats, but you should let me open it." Elena's hands shook as she pulled back the brown paper wrapping to reveal a shoebox containing a burned fragment of gray wool, the edges charred black, and a note written in block letters that read, "You shouldn't have interfered." The blanket, her blanket, the one she had wrapped around Cassian that first morning, and someone had burned it and sent her the ashes as a message. Marcus was already on his radio, barking orders that sent the estate into lockdown, all exits sealed, and security teams mobilizing. And within minutes, Lucian appeared looking more dangerous than Elena had yet seen him. "Did you tell anyone where you were?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut. "No," Elena said truthfully. "I have no one left to tell." "Then someone inside leaked your presence," Lucian said grimly. "Someone with access to security footage from that morning, someone who knew exactly what you gave my son." The paranoia that followed was suffocating. Staff members questioned and re-questioned, Victor Oleander subjected to hours of interrogation despite his 2 centuries of loyal service, even Dr. Chen brought in and asked to account for her movements. Elena watched the household tear itself apart, looking for a traitor, and felt guilt settle heavy in her chest because she had triggered this crisis simply by being kind to a lost child. Cassian felt the tension like animals feel earthquakes, some instinct warning him that danger approached, and he stopped speaking again, retreated to his room and refused to come out despite Elena's pleas. She stood outside his locked door that evening, ignoring Lucian's orders to stay in the secure wing, and began to sing the lullaby that had first calmed him. Minutes passed, then an hour, her voice growing hoarse but refusing to stop, and finally she heard the lock click open. Cassian stood in the doorway, small and terrified, and Elena knelt to his level. "I won't leave you," she promised, pulling him into a hug. "Not like everyone else did. I'm staying right here." From the corridor's shadows, Lucian listened to that promise and felt fear claw at his chest because he knew she meant it, knew she would keep that vow even if it killed her, and he was terrified that it would. That by bringing her into his world, he had signed her death warrant, and all his power could not protect her from the consequences of her own fierce loyalty. The music box appeared without ceremony while Elena reorganized Cassian's closet, her fingers brushing against loose baseboard that shifted when she pressed too hard, revealing a compartment so cunningly concealed that only accident could have exposed it. Silver and small, engraved with roses and musical notes that wound around its surface in delicate spirals, the box felt cool in her palm and substantial in a way that suggested value beyond mere decoration. She opened the lid, and a mechanism inside played a melody she recognized immediately, the same lullaby that calmed Cassian when nightmares clawed at his sleep. And nestled in faded velvet sat a journal bound in leather soft with age and use. Marianne Montclair, the first page announced in handwriting that flowed with practiced elegance, and Elena's breath caught because this was Cassian's mother speaking from beyond death, her thoughts preserved in ink and hidden where only deliberate searching would uncover them. Elena carried the journal to her room and locked the door with hands that trembled slightly, some instinct warning that what lay within these pages held danger enough to require absolute privacy, and she settled onto the bed to read words written by a woman who had loved the same child Elena now protected. The early entries detailed transformation, a human woman dying of aggressive cancer, who had caught a vampire king's heart strongly enough that he offered her immortality, rather than watch her fade. And Marianne wrote about waking into her new existence with wonder and terror, equally balanced. She described falling in love with Lucien again, as if meeting him fresh, discovering vampire society with its intricate politics and ancient grudges, the joy of conceiving despite the rarity of vampire pregnancy, and Cassian's birth which brought immediate complications that the best physicians could not explain. He was born with open eyes that tracked nothing, Marianne had written, and the doctors called it genetic mutation, a flaw in bloodlines that sometimes manifests in children of mixed heritage, a disability without cure or treatment beyond acceptance. They told me to be grateful he was otherwise healthy, to accept his blindness as unchangeable. But I remember being human, and I remember what human medicine accomplished through determination and research. So I began investigating what vampire physicians dismissed as impossible. The journal transformed into research log, pages dense with medical terminology and genetic theory, notes from consultations with human specialists. Marianne visited under false identities, experiments with cellular regeneration adapted for vampire physiology. She had pursued the question of sight with obsessive focus, convinced that what vampire medicine called permanent disability might yield to approaches that combined human innovation with vampire capabilities. And her entries grew increasingly excited as patterns emerged from her data. I am close to understanding, she wrote 6 months before her death, closer than anyone has come to explaining why certain vampire children lose vision while others develop abilities beyond normal perception. The blindness is not random malfunction, but deliberate activation, cells in the optic system, transforming in response to stimuli we do not yet understand. Building structures that process information differently than conventional sight. Cassian is not broken. He is changing into something new, and if I can document this process completely, I can prove that disability and evolution are sometimes the same phenomenon viewed from different perspectives. The tone shifted abruptly 3 months before the fire, excitement replaced by paranoia and fear that seeped through every sentence. Someone knows what I am researching, Marianne wrote in script that had lost its earlier confidence. My laboratory was searched while I attended council meetings. Questions have been asked about my frequent absences, and Victor watches me with expressions I cannot interpret, despite 200 years of reading vampire faces. If the Ember Court discovers what I have found, they will come for Cassian not to kill, but to capture, to experiment and dissect, and use him as proof of concept for genetic manipulation that could remake vampire society. I have hidden my physical research in locations only Lucien knows, but the most important data cannot be stored in laboratories or journals because it exists as living proof inside my son's developing biology. The final entry made Elena's hands shake badly enough that she nearly dropped the journal. Words written 2 days before Marianne's death in script that looked hurried and desperate. They know I am close. Evidence of surveillance is too obvious to ignore anymore. And I fear the attack will come soon, regardless of precautions we have implemented. If anything happens to me, the research is hidden in the one place Lucian would never look, the one thing he would never destroy, because it is part of our son, and he loves Cassian too fiercely to see him as anything but damaged and in need of protection. The answer is in the blindness itself, in what appears as disability, but functions as adaptation. And whoever finds this journal must understand that Cassian is not suffering from trauma or genetics gone wrong, but from evolution that his body activated to protect abilities still developing beneath the surface. Help him become what he is meant to be. Teach him that difference is not weakness, and keep him safe until he is strong enough to defend himself against everyone who will want to control what he represents. The journal ended there, mid-revelation, and Elena sat staring at the final page until her eyes burned, because the implications rewrote everything she thought she understood about Cassian's condition. Marianne had hidden her research in her son's biology, encoded in cellular structures that appeared broken but were actually building something unprecedented, and if the theory held weight, then every assumption about treating Cassian's blindness was fundamentally wrong. She needed medical confirmation, expert analysis that could verify or disprove what Marianne's research suggested, and that meant involving Dr. Chen, despite the risk that anyone in Lucien's inner circle might be the traitor who had betrayed Marianne. The doctor arrived within an hour of Elena's urgent summons, listening to journal passages read aloud with an expression that shifted from professional skepticism to fascinated attention. "I need to examine Cassian again," Dr. Chen said when Elena finished reading, using equipment more sophisticated than initial diagnostics, looking for cellular activity rather than structural damage. "Lucian will not approve," Elena warned, knowing the Vampire King's protective instincts would resist anything that felt invasive. "Then we proceed without informing him until we have concrete results," Dr. Chen replied with surprising bluntness. Because if Marianne was correct, and Cassian's blindness represents mutation rather than injury, then everything we believe about his condition is mistaken, and the danger he faces is completely different than we assumed. The examination happened in the medical wing with Cassian surprisingly cooperative, perhaps sensing Elena's urgency, or maybe just trusting her enough to accept discomfort without protest, and Dr. Chen deployed instruments that looked too advanced for a private clinic. Machines that hummed and projected holographic displays of cellular structures magnified thousands of times. The doctor worked in concentrated silence, while Elena held Cassian's hand and narrated what was happening in terms designed to inform without frightening, describing lights and sounds as exploration rather than diagnosis, promising repeatedly that nothing would cause pain. When Dr. Chen finally stepped back from the scanner, her face held equal measures, wonder and concern, professional composure cracking to reveal genuine astonishment at what the data showed. "His optic nerves are completely intact," the doctor said quietly, gesturing to holographic images that floated in the air between them. "Structurally perfect with no damage from trauma or genetic malformation. But look at the retinal cells here." And she magnified a section until individual cells became visible, pulsing with bioluminescent markers. "There is activity I have never encountered before, structures that appear to be growing rather than degenerating, like his eyes are building something new instead of repairing something damaged." "What kind of structures?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew the answer from Marianne's journal descriptions. "A secondary visual system," Dr. Chen said slowly, as if testing the hypothesis aloud, "one that processes light in spectrums or dimensions that conventional equipment cannot measure accurately." Marianne was correct. Cassian is not blind because of trauma or disability. He is blind because his eyes are evolving into something that neither human nor traditional vampire vision can accommodate yet, and his current inability to see normally is a transitional state rather than permanent condition. The implications crashed over Elena like a physical force, because if this was true, then everything about protecting Cassian needed to change. His blindness was not weakness to overcome, but potential to nurture, and the Ember Court's attacks took on completely different meaning. "They are not trying to kill him," she said aloud as understanding crystallized. "They are trying to capture him for experimentation," Dr. Chen confirmed grimly. "Because if they know what Marianne discovered, if they understand that Cassian represents evolutionary advancement for vampire kind, then he is worth infinitely more alive than dead, and every attack has been designed to create chaos that would enable extraction during the confusion." Elena felt her role transform in that moment. She was no longer merely a caretaker protecting a traumatized child, but the guardian of something unprecedented. And Cassian trusted her in ways he trusted no one else, including his father, which made her the key to whatever came next. That trust positioned her as the only person who could help Cassian understand and control emerging abilities. And Lucian needed to know the truth regardless of how he might react to their deception. The Vampire King listened in the study where Elena had first encountered him, his expression unreadable as Dr. Chen presented medical evidence and Elena read passages from Marianne's journal aloud. Silence held when they finished, stretching long enough that Elena wondered if Lucian would rage at their investigation conducted without his knowledge, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried grief rather than anger. "She knew," he said quietly, staring at nothing with eyes that held centuries of accumulated sorrow. "Marianne understood what our son was becoming, and she died protecting that knowledge. And I have spent 2 years trying to fix him when I should have been nurturing whatever he is meant to become." "The political situation makes sense now," Lucien continued, rising to pace the study's length with predatory grace. "The Ember Court is not attempting to destabilize governance through random violence. They are specifically targeting children who might carry the mutation, gathering subjects to understand and replicate the evolution. Marianne was betrayed by someone with access to her research, someone close enough to know what she had discovered and valuable enough to the Ember Court that they would trade lives for information." "Someone in your inner circle," Elena said, hating the words but unable to avoid the conclusion. "Marcus or Victor or Isadora or Theron, even Dr. Chen potentially, all of them had access to Marianne and opportunity to betray her, and we cannot identify the traitor until they reveal themselves through action." Lucian's hands clenched, but he nodded acknowledgement of the terrible logic. "Two choices present themselves," he said slowly, neither offering acceptable outcomes. "If we help Cassian's mutation complete, if we guide his development and give him whatever vision he is evolving toward, he becomes visible proof that the evolution is real and controllable, making him a target that our enemies will never stop pursuing. But if we suppress his development to maintain his safety, we keep him imprisoned by fear, and he never becomes who he is meant to be." The dilemma hung between them until Elena spoke the thought that had been forming since she first read Marianne's final entry. "Then we teach him to fight in the dark," she said with conviction that surprised her. "We stop treating his blindness as disability and start training him to weaponize his other senses. We help his mutation develop, but we make him dangerous enough that capturing him becomes too costly to attempt." "You would transform my 6-year-old son into a weapon," Lucian said, and his tone made the words a question rather than accusation. "I would transform him into someone who does not need constant protection," Elena corrected, "someone capable of defending himself, because the alternative is keeping him helpless and hoping we are strong enough to stand between him and everyone who wants to exploit what he represents." The Vampire King considered this in silence that felt weighted with decision, and when he spoke again, his voice held resolution that promised action. "Then we train him carefully, building confidence while maintaining the appearance that he remains the broken, traumatized child everyone expects to see. We identify the traitor by observing who moves when they believe Cassian is vulnerable, and we prepare for conflict because the Ember Court will eventually attack regardless of our readiness." Elena felt the power shift settle around her like armor, the recognition that she had stopped being a passive victim of circumstances and become an active participant in events that could reshape vampire society fundamentally. Marianne's research was encoded in her son's biology, living data that could not be stolen or destroyed, and Elena now carried responsibility for helping that research manifest safely while protecting Cassian from exploitation. The music box sat on the desk, still playing its delicate melody, and Lucien lifted it with hands that trembled slightly despite centuries of practiced control. She left this for him to find when he was old enough to understand, the Vampire King said quietly. A message from his mother telling him that he is not broken, that he is perfect exactly as he is, and becoming something magnificent. We honor her memory by ensuring he survives long enough to discover what she died protecting. Elena nodded, understanding that they had reached the story's midpoint, that everything would escalate from here forward, and that the only path led through whatever darkness waited ahead with certainty of conflict and uncertainty of survival. But some things were worth fighting for even when victory seemed impossible, and Cassian was absolutely one of those things. The training began the morning after revelations transformed their understanding of what Cassian represented. And Elena approached Marcus Hale with a proposal that shifted her role from caretaker to strategist in ways that surprised even herself. She found the vampire enforcer in the estate's lower gymnasium, a space designed for combat rather than casual fitness, and she presented her idea with the confidence of someone who had spent years perfecting performances through relentless discipline. "We need to teach Cassian to weaponize his echolocation," she said without preamble, "to sense threats before they arrive and defend himself using sound as his primary guide instead of treating blindness as a limitation to overcome." Marcus studied her with the assessing gaze of a soldier evaluating a recruit, and after a long moment, he nodded slowly. "You want me to train a 6-year-old child in vampire combat techniques adapted for someone who navigates the world differently than any fighter I have ever encountered," he said. And when Elena confirmed this, he smiled with something approaching respect. "Marianne would have approved of you," he said quietly. "She also refused to accept that limitations were permanent. And if we are doing this, we start immediately because children learn faster than adults, and time is a luxury we do not possess." The first session happened that afternoon, with the gymnasium cleared to create open space, and Marcus began with fundamentals that seemed almost insultingly simple until Elena understood the foundation he was building. "Close your eyes," he instructed Elena first, demonstrating techniques on her before attempting them with Cassian, "and tell me what you hear when I move." She obeyed and discovered that vampire movement created distinct sounds, the whisper of displaced air, and the subtle friction of fabric, and a nearly subsonic vibration of something powerful moving through space with predatory grace. Marcus circled her slowly, and she tracked him by sound alone, her other senses sharpening to compensate for absent vision, and when he stopped she pointed directly at his position without hesitation. "Now feel the air pressure," he said, moving closer. "Vampires displace space differently than humans because we move faster and with more force, learn to sense the change in atmosphere, and you can predict movement before it completes." Elena concentrated and felt it, a shift in the air around her like the pressure change before a storm, and she understood how Cassian might develop this sensitivity into something approaching precognition if properly trained. The sessions with Cassian built on these principles systematically, Marcus constructing obstacle courses that the boy navigated by clicking softly and listening to reverb, teaching him to sense movement through changes in air pressure and temperature, adapting combat techniques so that sound became both weapon and shield. Cassian absorbed the training with intensity that suggested he had been waiting for someone to treat his difference as advantage rather than disability, and within days he could navigate complex environments with confidence that bordered on supernatural. "Watch," Marcus said during one session with both Elena and Lucien observing, and he moved through the gymnasium at speeds that blurred even to vampire vision, while Cassian stood motionless in the center. The boy's head tracked Marcus perfectly, his clicks creating a three-dimensional map of the space, and when the enforcer attacked from behind, Cassian ducked and rolled away before the strike could land. He is using sound to see into the immediate future, Marcus explained with poorly concealed amazement, processing acoustic data fast enough that he perceives intention before action completes, and with more training, he will become nearly impossible to surprise regardless of an opponent's speed. Elena watched Lucien during these sessions and saw guilt and pride war in his expression. The Vampire King clearly torn between joy at his son's progress and grief that it had taken an outsider to unlock potential that had existed all along. "You are doing well," Lucien told Cassian after one particularly successful session, his voice rough with emotion he rarely displayed, and the boy's face lit with pleasure at receiving praise he had craved for 2 years. Late one night, Elena sat alone in the music room, exhausted from a day of training and planning, her fingers absently playing scales on the Steinway, while her mind processed everything that had changed in 3 weeks. She did not hear Lucien enter, vampire stealth rendering him silent when he chose, and his voice startled her when he spoke from the doorway. "You did not have to do this," he said quietly, moving into the room with the predatory grace that marked his kind. "The debt does not require you to love him or to transform yourself into a strategist preparing a child for war." Elena's hands stilled on the keys, and she turned to face him fully, meeting his ancient eyes with mortal directness. "I am not doing this because of the debt," she said simply, and the truth of it hung in the air between them like a confession. Lucien crossed to the piano and stood close enough that she could feel the unnatural coolness of his presence, and for a long moment neither spoke. "I do not know how to be a father without Marianne," he admitted finally, the words dragged from some deep place he rarely accessed. "She understood him in ways I never could. She knew how to reach him when he retreated into himself, and without her I have been lost and afraid that every choice I make will damage him further." Elena stood and faced him at eye level despite the height difference, and her response came from the same fierce certainty that had driven her to protect Cassian from the beginning. "You start by showing up," she said gently. "You start by being present even when you do not know what to do, and you are already halfway there whether you recognize it or not." Lucien's hand lifted as if to reach for hers, and then stopped, hovering in the space between them while conflict played across his features. "You are mortal," he said, and the words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. "I cannot allow myself to feel what I am beginning to feel, because you will age and die and I will remain, and I have already survived losing one person I loved beyond reason." "I know," Elena said quietly, but neither of them moved away, the almost moment stretching between them charged with possibility and impossibility, equally balanced. The invitation from Lady Isadora arrived 3 days later on heavy cardstock, embossed with gold, a summons to a garden party phrased as courtesy, but carrying the weight of command. "You must attend," Victor said when he delivered it, his expression suggesting he anticipated Elena's discomfort with malicious pleasure. "This is Lady Isadora testing whether the mortal can navigate vampire politics without embarrassing the king, and your performance will be observed and judged by everyone who matters." Elena accepted the invitation with outward calm, while internally cataloging everything she did not know about vampire social customs, and the days before the event, filled with etiquette lessons from Victor, who seemed to enjoy watching her struggle with arcane rules about precedence and address. Isadora sent a gown that fit perfectly, deep blue silk that probably cost more than Elena had earned in a year, and jewelry that looked antique and priceless, gifts that felt like traps designed to put her in debt. Marcus gave her a hairpin on the morning of the party, silver core disguised as decorative accessory, and his instructions were brief and serious. "If anyone tries to compel you, the blood debt protection should hold. But if it fails, or if physical threat emerges, this pin is pure silver and will cause significant damage to vampire flesh, Use it without hesitation if necessary. The garden party took place at Isadora's estate, which made Lucien's house look modest by comparison. Sprawling grounds filled with roses that bloomed impossibly in November, and guests who glittered with centuries of accumulated wealth and power. Elena arrived with Lucien and Marcus flanking her like guards, and she felt every eye assess her worth and find her wanting mortal fragility obvious among beings who had forgotten what weakness meant. The conversations were minefields, where every word carried multiple meanings, compliments that concealed insults and questions designed to expose ignorance, and Elena navigated them with the performer's skill of reading audiences and adapting her presentation accordingly. She discussed music with vampires who remembered Mozart personally, deflected questions about her relationship with Lucienne with careful ambiguity, and generally survived 2 hours of social combat without obvious missteps. The powder room offered temporary refuge, a moment to breathe away from scrutiny, and Elena was touching up makeup she rarely wore when Isadora's voice carried through the partially open window. "The child is progressing faster than expected," the vampire said into a phone, her tone clipped and businesslike. "Move up the timeline. We cannot risk him developing full control before we act, and the mortal has complicated matters by making him harder to isolate." Elena froze, her heart hammering loud enough that she worried vampires would hear it, and she understood with sickening clarity that Isadora was the traitor, that the elegant vampire who smiled and played politics had been feeding information to the Ember Court all along. Isadora ended the call and entered the powder room, her smile freezing when she saw Elena's reflection in the mirror. "You heard," she said flatly, not bothering with denial. Elena turned to face her directly, anger overriding fear. "You think Lucian is the hero of this story," Isadora said before Elena could speak. "But he has been stalling our entire race's evolution by hiding his son's mutation, keeping proof of what we could become locked away out of fear and sentiment while the Ember Court offers actual progress." "You betrayed Marianne," Elena said, her voice shaking with fury. "You sold her to people who murdered her and traumatized a child, and you call that progress?" Isadora's eyes flashed and she stepped closer, vampire speed making the movement blur. "You are mortal, and you understand nothing about what we need to survive in a changing world," she said, and then her eyes locked onto Elena's with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. "You will forget this conversation and return to the party," she commanded, vampire compulsion rolling over Elena like a wave. "Forget what you heard and smile and let the adults handle complex political matters." Elena felt the compulsion slide off her like water, the blood debt protection rendering her immune to mental manipulation, and Isadora's shock gave her the split second needed to act. She grabbed the silver hairpin from her elaborately styled hair and drove it into Isadora's shoulder with all her strength, the vampire's scream of pain bringing immediate response from outside. Marcus and Lucien crashed through the door, weapons drawn, and they found Isadora wounded and furious, while Elena stood her ground with a bloody hairpin clutched in trembling hands. "She attacked me," Isadora shouted, compelling enough to make it almost believable. "The mortal went mad and stabbed me without provocation. She is dangerous and unstable, and must be removed from the king's household immediately." The accusation brought the entire party to witness, vampires crowding into the powder room and spilling into the hallway, and Elena saw political calculation on every face as they chose which version of events to believe. Magistrate Theron demanded a formal inquiry, his ancient authority carrying weight that even Lucian could not dismiss, while others argued that Elena should be expelled immediately or held for trial. Half the assembly sided with Isadora, while the other half demanded evidence, and Elena stood silent in the center of the storm, knowing that her word meant nothing against vampires among their own kind. "Lucian could maintain political stability by voiding the blood debt," Marcus murmured urgently, "sacrificing you to preserve the fragile alliance that keeps our government functional." The vampire king stood silent for a long moment, his face expressionless in the way that meant he was processing multiple scenarios simultaneously, and when he spoke, his voice carried absolute authority that silenced all argument. "She is under my eternal protection," Lucien said clearly, meeting the eyes of everyone present in turn. "Anyone who touches her, anyone who threatens her, anyone who questions her place in my household answers to me personally, and I promise the consequences will be memorable." The pronouncement created immediate schism. Theron and two other assembly members walking out in protest. Their departure a public pledge of loyalty to the Ember Court over the established vampire government, and Elena understood that her action had fractured vampire society in ways that would reshape everything going forward. The estate went into lockdown the moment they returned, Marcus barking orders that sent security personnel scrambling and sealed every entrance with protocols designed for siege warfare. "Isadora has been feeding information to the Ember Court for months," the enforcer confirmed after reviewing surveillance logs. "Everything from Cassian's progress to our security layouts to Marianne's research, and her communication with them suggests an attack is imminent, probably within 48 hours. Lucien wanted to evacuate Cassian immediately, sending him to a safe house in Europe with guards numerous enough to hold off an army, but the boy refused with a vehemence that shocked everyone. "I will not leave Elena," Cassian said fiercely, his blind eyes turned toward where she stood, and Elena found herself equally determined. "I will not leave Lucien or Cassian," she said, meeting the Vampire King's frustrated gaze. "We stay together or not at all." The compromise was preparation rather than flight, fortifying the estate with UV floodlights at every entrance that could weaponize sunlight against vampire attackers, securing blood supplies because vampires needed to feed before battle, evacuating human staff who could become casualties or hostages. Dr. Chen refused to leave despite lacking combat ability, insisting that medical support would be necessary regardless of the battle's outcome, and her stubborn loyalty reminded Elena that courage came in many forms. That evening, Cassian came to Elena terrified in ways he had not shown since she first arrived, and he asked her to sing him to sleep with a desperation that broke her heart. She settled in the chair beside his bed and began the lullaby that had become their ritual, her voice soft and steady, and partway through the song, Lucien appeared in the doorway. He did not speak, just entered quietly and sat on the edge of the bed, his presence completing a picture that looked almost like family if you ignored the impossibility of the situation. "What happens after?" Cassian asked when the song ended, his small voice uncertain in the darkness. "What happens after we fight, and people get hurt, and things change?" Neither adult had an answer that would not be a lie, so they sat in silence holding the question between them like a weight too heavy for words, and eventually Cassian's breathing evened into sleep, while Elena and Lucien remained motionless, unwilling to break the fragile moment of peace before violence arrived. 6 hours before the projected attack, Elena sat alone writing a letter to no one, trying to process how 3 weeks had transformed her from a homeless musician to someone preparing for supernatural warfare. The words flowed without structure or purpose, just an attempt to anchor herself before everything changed again, and she had filled 3 pages when Lucien found her. "If we survive this, what happens to us?" she asked without preamble, because the question had been building since their almost moment in the music room, and she needed to know his answer. "The blood debt ends when you release me or when you die," Lucien said quietly, "and I do not want either outcome. I have not let myself feel anything since Marianne died," he continued. The confession dragged from somewhere deep and protected. "But you made me remember what it is like to hope, what it is like to imagine a future beyond mere survival, and I am terrified of losing that again." Elena stood and crossed to where he sat, her mortal warmth meeting his vampire cold, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, despite the fear that matched his. "I know all the reasons this is impossible," she said. "I know I will age and die while you remain unchanged, I know your world is dangerous and complicated, and nothing like the life I imagined, but none of that changes what I feel. The kiss was tentative and desperate simultaneously, a choice made in the shadow of potential death. And for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them and the fragile connection they had built despite every obstacle. The moment shattered when alarms blared through the estate, harsh and urgent, and Marcus's voice came over the intercom clipped with battle readiness. "They are early," he said. "The Ember Court is at the gates, and they brought an army. Everyone to positions immediately." Elena and Lucian broke apart, the kiss ending as abruptly as it began, and they moved toward their assigned stations, knowing that everything they had built was about to be tested by fire and blood, and the possibility that none of them would survive to see morning. The attack began with silence, that terrible moment before violence when the world holds its breath, and then the outer perimeter exploded in coordinated strikes that lit the night with fire and concentrated UV light. 23 Ember Court vampires breached the estate's defenses simultaneously, their assault so precisely timed that it spoke of extensive inside knowledge, and Elena watched security monitors flash red as sensors triggered across multiple access points. Marcus led the ground floor defense with the brutal efficiency of someone who had survived centuries of combat, his movements blurring between opponents as vampire fought vampire with speed that made human perception irrelevant. The combat was savage and fast, bodies colliding with impacts that cracked marble floors, limbs torn away with casual violence, and through it all, Marcus coordinated his forces with clipped commands that revealed tactical genius honed across countless battles. Lucian commanded from the security hub, surrounded by screens showing multiple angles of the attack, his ancient mind processing information faster than any human could track, calling out positions and weaknesses while his people fought and died defending his home. Elena and Cassian were locked in the panic room as planned. Reinforced steel walls that promised safety, no windows to compromise their protection. But the sounds of battle penetrated even those barriers, and Elena felt each explosion and scream like physical blows. The Ember Court brought weapons designed specifically for vampire warfare, daylight grenades that burst with concentrated UV radiation, turning vampire flesh to ash in seconds, and Elena watched through the security feed as two of Lucian's guards were incinerated before they could retreat to shadow. Marcus took a burn across his shoulder that left his jacket smoking, the flesh beneath charred black. But he fought through the pain without pause and eliminated 3 attackers in rapid succession. The battle raged for 15 minutes that felt like hours. Lucian's forces holding the ground floor through discipline and superior knowledge of the terrain, but the Ember Court pressed forward with suicidal determination that suggested they had orders to succeed regardless of casualties. The breach came when attackers using shaped charges blew through the conservatory's reinforced glass, flooding the second floor with enemies who moved with coordinated precision toward a single objective. "They are coming for Cassian," Lucian said into the radio, his voice tight with controlled fear. "All forces fall back to defend the panic room. We cannot let them reach the 3rd floor." Inside the panic room, Cassian had gone rigid with terror, the sounds of combat overwhelming his heightened senses in ways that paralyzed him completely. The clicks he used for echolocation came in panicked bursts that mapped nothing useful, his breathing shallow and rapid, and Elena recognized trauma response when she saw it. The boy was shutting down exactly as he had after his mother's death, retreating into himself where the horror could not reach him, and if she did not anchor him soon, he would be lost to catatonia regardless of whether they survived the attack. She made a choice born of desperation and began to sing, not the gentle lullaby that usually calmed him, but a battle hymn she had performed at her conservatory graduation, something with power and structure and defiant hope woven through every note. Her voice cut through the chaos of combat sounds, giving Cassian something to focus on besides fear, and she watched his breathing slowly stabilize as he latched onto the melody like a lifeline. "Keep singing," he whispered, his hands unclenching from their white-knuckled grip on his knees. I can hear you over everything else. I can find you in the sound. The awakening happened gradually as Cassian's echolocation sharpened with focus, rather than scattering in panic, his clicks creating a three-dimensional map of the entire building that extended far beyond the panic room's walls. "Three of them are coming up the east stairs," he said suddenly, his blind eyes tracking movement Elena could not see. "They are moving fast, but one is injured, dragging his left leg, and there are two more in the hallway outside this room." Elena grabbed the radio Lucian had given her and relayed the information, her voice urgent. "East stairs, 3 attackers, 1 wounded, plus 2 outside the panic room." Lucian's response came immediately. "How does he know this?" he demanded, but Marcus was already redirecting forces to intercept. The information proved accurate. Lucian's guards ambushing the East Stair group exactly where Cassian predicted. And suddenly, the boy became a tactical advantage nobody had anticipated. "Tell me everything you hear," Elena said to Cassian, and together they became the estate's eyes and ears, his supernatural perception combined with her ability to communicate, turning them into an intelligence hub that shifted the battle's momentum. The turning point came when Dorian Ashcroft entered the estate, his presence announced by sudden silence as both sides recognized that the real power had arrived. The Ember Court commander moved through the building like a force of nature, 600 years of accumulated strength and speed making him nearly unstoppable, and his voice boomed through every speaker when he accessed the estate's communication system. "Surrender the child and your people live," Dorian broadcast with absolute confidence. "Refuse and I burn this place to bedrock with everyone inside. You have 5 minutes to comply." Lucian stalled, his voice carrying diplomatic courtesy that masked frantic calculation. "Let us discuss terms," he said smoothly. "You want my son for research purposes. Surely we can negotiate conditions that serve both our interests without further bloodshed." The delay bought time for triangulation, technical staff tracking Dorian's signal to pinpoint his location, but before they could act, the panic room door opened from the outside, using override codes that should not have existed. Victor stood in the doorway holding a modified weapon that fired wooden stakes with enough force to penetrate vampire flesh, and his expression held guilty determination that made Elena's heart sink. "I am sorry," he said quietly, looking at Elena rather than Cassian. "But our race needs this child more than one king's love does. Evolution demands sacrifice, and I choose progress over sentiment." Elena understood in that moment that Victor had been the leak all along, not Isadora who had merely been a distraction, and the betrayal cut deeper because she had almost started to trust the ancient vampire. She launched herself at Victor with no plan beyond preventing him from taking Cassian, her fists striking his chest with impacts that probably hurt her more than him. And he caught her almost gently before throwing her against the wall with casual vampire strength. The impact cracked ribs and possibly gave her a concussion, pain exploding through her torso as she slid to the floor gasping. But she saw Victor lift Cassian and carry him toward the door, with the boy struggling uselessly against strength that could crush steel. The main hall became an arena when Victor brought Cassian to where Dorian waited, the Ember Court commander, examining the boy with clinical interest that made Elena's skin crawl. Lucian appeared on the grand staircase with theatrical timing, descending slowly, while every eye tracked his movement, and he looked every inch the Vampire King in that moment. "You want my son," he said with deadly calm. "You go through me first." The duel that followed was old-world vampire combat stripped of modern weapons or tactics. Just two ancient predators using speed and strength, and 600 years of accumulated savagery. Dorian was faster, his movements almost precognitive, but Lucien was older and stronger, his strikes carrying enough force to crack stone when they connected. They fought across the hall, destroying furniture and decorations, their impacts leaving craters in marble floors, and Lucien took 3 serious wounds that would have killed a human instantly, but only slowed him marginally. Elena crawled across the hall with broken ribs, sending agony through every breath. Driven by instinct she did not fully understand, and she reached the grand piano that sat in the corner untouched by combat. Her fingers found the keys and she began playing the lullaby Marianne had written, the melody she had learned from the music box, and the familiar notes cut through the sound of battle like a blade. Cassian heard it from where Victor held him captive, and his body went still, recognition replacing fear, and he began to hum along with the melody, just as he had during their first breakthrough weeks ago. The humming built in intensity and volume, Cassian's undeveloped powers responding to emotional extremity and musical structure, and what started as a child's voice became something that transcended normal sound. The frequency escalated into a scream that shattered every window in the hall simultaneously, cracks spreading through stone walls like spiderwebs, and every vampire in the building dropped to their knees with hands clamped over ears that bled from rupture. His mutation was not sight, but sound manipulation on a molecular level, the ability to generate and control frequencies that could destroy matter and incapacitate anyone who heard them. And Cassian had just weaponized it instinctively, in the same way a drowning person learns to swim. The scream lasted perhaps 10 seconds before Cassian's voice broke and the sound cut off abruptly, but the damage was done. Dorian's forces fled in disarray, their commander himself barely escaping with second-degree burns where the frequency had vibrated his cells to the point of combustion, and within minutes the estate was empty except for Lucien's people and the wreckage of what had been a home. The cost of victory became apparent in the silence that followed. 6 of Lucien's guards dead, Marcus critically injured with burns and blood loss that even vampire healing struggled to address, the estate half destroyed with structural damage that would take months to repair. Victor remained restrained and waiting for judgment, his ancient eyes holding acceptance of whatever sentence came, and Lucian stood over him with an expression that promised death. The judgment was immediate and harsh, exile to daylight, which meant burning alive as the sun rose, a death sentence carried out by nature rather than execution, but no less final for the distinction. Lucien pronounced it in a voice empty of emotion, 200 years of loyal service erased by a single act of betrayal. And guards moved to drag Victor to the east terrace where Dawn would find him. Elena forced herself upright despite broken ribs that made breathing agony and spoke before she could second-guess the impulse. "He saved Cassian's life 2 years ago during the fire," she said, her voice ragged but clear. "That is why you trusted him, because he proved his loyalty when it mattered most, and you should not let this war erase who you used to be." Lucien turned to her with eyes that held centuries of accumulated grief and rage. "You defend the man who gave my son to our enemies," he said, and Elena met that ancient gaze without flinching. "I defend mercy over vengeance, because one of those things honors Marianne's memory and the other spits on it," she replied. "You decide which kind of king you want to be." The mercy Lucien granted was exile instead of death, stripping Victor of his fangs in a procedure that was painful and humiliating, but not fatal, reducing him to something less than vampire, but more than human. The ancient vampire accepted the sentence without protest, understanding that he deserved far worse, and when guards led him away, Elena felt no satisfaction in the intervention. Dr. Chen examined Cassian once the immediate crisis passed and confirmed what they had witnessed. The boy's blindness was a chrysalis state, while his brain rewired itself to process sound in ways that gave him abilities beyond normal perception. In time, he might regain conventional sight, the doctor explained, but he will also have this sonic ability, and we have no framework for understanding its full potential or helping him control it safely. The political fallout from the attack rippled through vampire society immediately. The Midnight Assembly in chaos, with 3 members having defected to the Ember Court, 2 dead in the fighting, and the remaining members scrambling to distance themselves from the losing side. Lucien's rule was weakened by the schism, but his ruthless defense of his son had earned grudging respect even from enemies. and the balance of power had shifted in ways that would take years to fully resolve. "What now?" Marcus asked from his hospital bed where Dr. Chen worked to repair burns that covered half his torso. Lucien looked at Elena, who stood despite her injuries because sitting hurt worse, then at Cassian, who was exhausted but alive and safe. "Now we rebuild," the Vampire King said quietly. "We repair what was broken. We strengthen what remains. We prepare for whatever comes next, because this was only the first battle, and the Ember Court will return eventually with new strategies and weapons. But tonight, we survived, and that is enough." Elena felt the weight of those words settle over the ruined hall, understanding that surviving was indeed enough for now, that they had passed through fire and emerged, changed but intact, and whatever future waited beyond the immediate crisis would be faced together. The dawn came slowly, filtering through shattered windows to illuminate destruction and victory equally, and Elena stood beside Lucian watching the sun rise over a world that had transformed completely in the space of 3 weeks. Cassian slept in her arms, his breathing even and peaceful, and for one fragile moment, she let herself believe that maybe they could build something lasting from the ruins of everything that had burned. 3 months passed in the rhythm of reconstruction, physical and emotional damage slowly healing through effort that felt endless but purposeful, and Elena watched the estate transform from battlefield ruin into something that resembled home again. Workers repaired shattered windows and cracked walls, replacing destroyed furniture and patching marble floors scarred by vampire combat, and the sounds of hammers and saws became background noise to daily life. Cassian spent hours with Dr. Chen learning to control his sonic ability, practicing frequencies that could shatter glass or simply carry his voice across impossible distances. And Elena observed these sessions with pride, tempered by awareness of how much responsibility rested on such small shoulders. She had been officially appointed his guardian through vampire legal processes that involved ceremonies and blood oaths and documentation in languages she could not read, a title that granted her status and authority unprecedented for mortals in their society. The blood debt clause remained unchanged, hovering over everything like a question waiting to be answered, because Elena could release Lucian at any moment and end both her protection and his obligation to her. The conversation happened on a spring evening when repairs were nearly complete and life had settled into patterns that felt almost normal. Lucian found Elena in the music room where she spent most free hours, her fingers moving across piano keys with the muscle memory of years spent perfecting her craft, and he waited until she finished the piece before speaking. "What do you want?" he asked without preamble, his ancient eyes holding vulnerability she had learned to recognize. "The debt binds us legally, but you could walk away tomorrow with enough money to rebuild your career, start fresh anywhere in the world, live a life free from vampire politics and constant danger." Elena's hands stilled on the keys and she turned to face him fully, meeting that ageless gaze with mortal directness. "I want to stay," she said simply. "Not because of the debt or obligation or fear of what waits outside these walls, but because this is home now in ways my old life never was." Lucien crossed to the piano and stood close enough that she could feel the unnatural coolness of his presence, his expression troubled in ways that suggested he had anticipated this answer but hoped for something different. "But you are mortal," he said quietly. "In 60 years you will be gone, and I will still be here, and I cannot watch another person I love fade while I remain unchanged." The offer hung between them, weighted with implications Elena understood perfectly. "There is a way to change that," Lucian said carefully. "If you want it, if you choose it freely without pressure or obligation, I could turn you and give you the centuries we would need to build something lasting. The transformation would be painful and permanent. You would become vampire and lose your humanity, but you would have time that mortals never possess." Elena felt her heart race at the possibility, eternal life and freedom from aging and death, the chance to stay with Cassian as he grew and to explore whatever connection was building between her and Lucien without the shadow of mortality destroying it. But something in her resisted the easy answer, some part that remembered being homeless and powerless and losing everything, and she asked for time to think before making a decision that could not be reversed. Lucien granted it without argument, understanding perhaps that choices made in haste carried consequences that echoed across centuries, and Elena spent 3 days wrestling with the question of what she truly wanted versus what seemed practical or safe. The mirror moment came when she visited the shelter where she had slept before Cassian found her, returning to the place that represented her lowest point to gain perspective on how far she had traveled. The people there still struggled with the same desperation she remembered, fighting for basic survival without hope of improvement, and Elena recognized that she had been given a choice they would never possess. She could walk away from the estate and rebuild her old life with resources Lucien would provide, or she could stay and accept transformation into something no longer human, or she could choose a third path that acknowledged uncertainty and embraced whatever time she had without guarantees of forever. The answer crystallized as she watched a young mother sing her child to sleep on a cot identical to the one Elena had used, and she understood that immortality meant nothing if it required abandoning the humanity that made her who she was in this moment. She returned to the estate and found Lucien in his study surrounded by reports and correspondence, the endless work of governing vampire society that never paused regardless of personal crisis. "I do not want eternity," Elena said without preamble, standing in the doorway with decision written clearly across her face. "Not yet, and maybe not ever, because I need to know that whatever we build is real, rather than just fear of being alone driving us toward easy answers. But I want whatever time we have, however long that turns out to be, and I want to spend it here with you and Cassian building something that matters." Lucien looked at her for a long moment, relief and disappointment warring in his expression, and when he spoke, his voice held acceptance. "Then we live in the now without promises of forever," he said. "I will not turn you unless you ask freely and without pressure. And you will stay as long as you choose, with the understanding that you can walk away whenever this stops being what you want." The compromise felt right in ways that absolute answers never could, acknowledging the reality that time was finite and precious and should be spent wisely rather than hoarded fearfully. The ritual presenting Cassian to the rebuilt Midnight Assembly happened on a cool evening when spring was transitioning into summer, vampire nobility gathering in the sub-level chambers to witness the heir demonstrate abilities that would shape their society's future. The boy stood in the center of the great hall wearing formal clothes that made him look older than 6, and when he began to sing, the frequency started low and built systematically, his voice creating harmonics that made stone walls vibrate in sympathy. Glass chimed without breaking. Dust motes danced in patterns dictated by sound waves, and every vampire present felt the power thrumming through their bones as Cassian demonstrated control that had taken 3 months of intensive training to develop. The performance was controlled and precise and beautiful, proving that what had seemed like destructive chaos during the battle could be refined into something approaching art. And when Cassian finished, the assembly voted unanimously to recognize him as Lucien's legitimate heir. Elena stood beside the vampire king throughout the presentation, and when the assembly acknowledged her as Lady Protector with status equal to vampire nobility, she felt the weight of unprecedented honor settle across her shoulders. No mortal had held such title in vampire society's recorded history, and the recognition meant both acceptance and target painted on her back for anyone who resented the change. The threat arrived the next morning in the form of a letter delivered through normal postal channels, elegant script on expensive paper that read simply, "This is not over. The Ember Court will rise again, and next time we will be prepared for your son's gifts." Dorian Ashcroft's signature marked the bottom, a reminder that the enemy had survived and was already planning their next move, and the letter transformed celebration into renewed urgency. Lucian convened a planning session that afternoon with Marcus and Dr. Chen and Elena, the four of them examining maps and intelligence reports while discussing how to fortify against attacks they could only guess at. "We need allies," Marcus said bluntly. "The Assembly is fractured and cannot be relied upon for unified defense, so we reach out to other vampire houses and build coalitions based on mutual interest in preventing the Ember Court from seizing power." Dr. Chen suggested research into Cassian's abilities might reveal weaknesses they could protect against, ways the Ember Court might try to neutralize or control his sonic manipulation if they captured him. Elena listened and contributed ideas drawn from her outsider perspective, and together they began constructing strategies that acknowledged the next conflict was inevitable while refusing to let fear dominate their present. That evening, Elena tucked Cassian into bed following their established ritual, the boy clean and fed and safe in ways that still felt miraculous after everything they had survived. "Will you stay forever?" he asked as she pulled blankets up to his chin, his blind eyes turned toward her with the trust that always made her chest tight. "I will stay as long as you need me," Elena said carefully, unwilling to promise eternity, but equally unwilling to plant fear of abandonment. "Then stay forever," Cassian whispered, already half asleep from exhaustion that followed intensive training sessions. "Because I will always need you." Elena kissed his forehead and slipped from the room, leaving the door cracked so light from the hallway would filter in, and she found Lucienne waiting on the balcony overlooking the city spread below like a carpet of lights. She joined him without speaking, leaning against his solid presence and his arm wrapped around her waist in a gesture that had become familiar over months of slowly built intimacy. "We are going to have to fight again," Lucian said quietly, staring at the city that held both allies and enemies in equal measure. "I know," Elena replied, "but tonight we won, and that is enough for now." The moment held peace and acceptance, two people who had survived impossible odds standing together facing whatever future waited beyond the immediate present. And Elena felt something settle in her chest that might have been contentment. The estate stretched behind them, scarred but standing with lights glowing warm against gathering darkness, and she understood that home was not a place but a choice to keep showing up regardless of how difficult the showing became. Somewhere in the city, Dorian Ashcroft stood watching the estate through binoculars, his burned face twisted in a smile that promised vengeance and renewed violence, and he lowered the binoculars with satisfaction at having confirmed his targets remained exactly where he needed them. The Ember Court would rise again, stronger and better prepared, and next time the outcome would be different, because he learned from defeat in ways that made him dangerous beyond mere power. But that was a problem for tomorrow, and tonight, Elena began singing softly, the lullaby that had become their anthem, and Cassian's voice joined hers from his bedroom in harmony that spoke of connection deeper than blood or obligation. The sound drifted across the balcony and into the night, a promise that some things endured beyond violence and loss, that family could be chosen rather than given, and that hope persisted even when darkness waited to reclaim whatever light they managed to kindle. Lucian pulled Elena closer and she leaned into his embrace, and together they stood watching their city while singing filled the space between heartbeats and the future remained unwritten, but no longer quite so terrifying as it had been when a homeless musician first sang to a lost boy and changed everything that came after.